Okay, welcome to sort of a review and roundup of chapter 10. You have had a lesson on cadences, which are the way we stop lines of music and come to rest, and they have certain chord formulas. We'll review that. But when you have music and you end in a cadence, that's called a phrase or a musical idea, thought, or sentence, right? A sentence is not a good word because we have a specific use for that word later. And when you combine phrases together, you end up getting form or structure. And we have names for those, which you have also started to foray into. You had to look at your textbook, and these were called periods, sentences, and even things like, repeated phrases or phrase groups, and so on. There's a whole bunch of them. Phrase groups. And there was even something called a double period. Okay, these are structures made when you combine certain kinds of phrases, means music plus a certain kind of cadence, together to make these things. There were also words that got used in there, like parallel and contrasting and symmetrical and asymmetrical, of course. Hope I'm spelling that right. Looks right to me. Okay. And then there's one that's not in the book that we're going to talk about today called modulating as well. All right. And we're going to do this because it's very common, but the book doesn't want to talk to you about it because it requires second year theory to completely understand, which is how we change keys as well, which is what modulating is related to. All right. So that being said, this is actually no more difficult than learning how to spell chords. We had certain kinds of notes that we put together, and then we had to modify the thirds and the fifths. And when we had the right recipe, it made a certain kind of chord, whether it was a triad or a seventh chord. Here we have music plus certain kinds of cadences, and that makes a phrase. And when you combine certain kinds of phrases together, they make structures that we give names to. So in chords, you knew that when we had like a major third and a minor third, that was a major triad. And not every combination of thirds or notes together makes certain kinds of chords. But many of them make specific ones. Well, with phrases, structure, lengths of music, combine them together, certain ones make certain patterns called periods, sentences, and then things like repeated phrases, double periods, phrase groups, and things. So I'm going to quickly review cadences. And if you know this, you can zoom ahead past it. But we have perfect authentic cadences, imperfect authentic cadences. We have half cadences, right? And we have deceptive cadences. I just put DC for deceptive, I guess. And we have plagal cadences. Now, there was also the Phrygian cadence, but it's not something we're going to worry about right now. In fact, we're mostly going to focus on these three, okay? These are the ones that use most of the time to make these things here. And maybe we'll talk about these too. But here's what you need to think about cadences to understand phrase combinations to make these form structures. We have to know which one is the most final and which one is the least final, because when we combine these phrases together, which is music plus a cadence, we want to combine them knowing which phrase has the most final kind of sounding ending. So here's the pecking order. This is the most final sounding. You want to end a piece of music or a phrase and make it sound like this would be a good place to stop. a perfect authentic cadence, which is a real 5 chord going to a real 1 chord, where they're both in root position, and they both have the 1 chord has the root at the top as well, right? And this is second place for finality, right? It's also an authentic cadence, but something about it, whether it could be a 5 chord substitute or one of the 5 chords kind of chords and the 1 chord is inverted, or the final chord, the 1 chord does not have root on top. If any of those things don't happen, then it's an imperfect authentic cadence, and that's second place, second most final, okay? Half cadence is, well, this gets kind of weird, but we're going to just say not final, because it says we've stopped, but we're on a 5 chord, and that really means we have to keep going, okay? I guess that if we had to place these guys here, this one would sit somewhere in there for like third place plagal cadences, right? And deceptives would be, it's hard to say whether it's least final or not, because it's not really, I mean, this says we've stopped, but we need to go on. It's honest about this. This one was like, we're going to go to the 1 chord, and we didn't. So I don't know. This almost never gets factored into these forms. 90% of the time, we're going to be working with these 3 cadences. They're the most commonly used. Occasionally, we'll see examples that use these. And at that point, we'll use our ears to gauge how final it sounds, okay? Or how terminative or terminated the line feels, all right? So how do we, you sort of have to know your definitions of the cadences. Real 5 going to real 1, right? It's got the leading tone in it. Root position 5, root position 1, and root on top of the 1 chord. Here, it's got some kind of dominant chord, could be a 5 chord, could be a 7 chord, going to a 1 chord, but it's not in root position, or it's not a real 5 chord, or the 1 chord is not in root position, or the 1 chord doesn't have the root on top, right, as its highest voice, and then it's imperfect authentic. It's half cadence, anything going to a 5, and it terminates and stops right there, right? Deceptive cadence, usually the 5 chord going to the 6 chord instead of the 1, but something that thinks, oh, the 1 chord's coming up, it's got a leading tone leading into it, and then it doesn't. Plagal cadence is 4 to 1. This can happen, and we might get an odd outlier where we have to judge what this is doing in terms of the pecking order of how final it is compared to the other phrase that we're looking at, but usually this comes, after, as an afterthought, after an authentic cadence, and we're not even concerned about Phrygian. All right. So with that out of the way, I'm going to erase these things here, and we're going to start talking about phrases combined making forms, okay? So, and then later we're going to get to the actual sounds of these things so that you can hear them in pieces of music, all right? So when we have music and we have a line of music, I'm going to play you just a little bit, and hopefully this will come through. This is the song we'll be looking at. Here's the first phrase. Okay, I'll do that one more time so you can hear it. All right. Okay, now can you hear that that's a thought? Come to a pause there, okay? We would represent that music with a bracket. Some books will make it an arc, right? And I'll just use blue right now for brackets, right? So the beginning, right? And then the music continues with another phrase. Right? So 2 phrases. We use brackets to represent graphically that time. I'm going to play it one more time for you, and you can just sort of recognize when the sound stops. Okay. Here we go. Phrase 1. End of a phrase. Beginning of the second phrase. Now, what we're really interested in is how did this phrase end and how did that phrase end right there? Okay. And the reason is because the kind of cadences that are there will tell us about what we call this overarching double phrase structure, what it has as a name. Okay. Now, if we listen to this, it'd be nicer if I put some music up for you to look at, but I really want you to use your ears. Is the note that we end on? Where's home? Where's the key that we're in? Where's do? And the answer is right there. It doesn't end on here's do. It ends on re, second note, right? And the chord that supports that is the 5 chord, right? And what we want to do is get good at listening to music and feeling where home is and seeing if we ended with an authentic cadence or whether we ended with a different cadence, like a half cadence, right? In this case, absolutely, the music ended on re, which is part of the so ti re chord. And if we were looking at the music, you'd find that this is a 5 chord right here. Okay, ended with a 5 chord. Cadences that end on 5 chords are called half cadences. And remember, this is not very final, right? And then ends on do. And if you're listening to it, you can hear the chords are lining up and making this seem like some kind of authentic cadence. And if we were to look at the music, and we'll do this in more detail later, but there's my E, G sharp, B, 5 chord in the key of A minor, right? So there's my half cadence. There's my do, A for A minor, and it's A, C, A. The E is missing, but it's an A chord. It's 1. And if we look here, 5, it's an E, G sharp, and B is right there. And so it's an authentic cadence, 5-1. The root of the 5 chord is in the bass. The root of the 1 chord is in the bass. It's a real 5 chord, not a 7. And when I get to the 1 chord, there's do on top, or the root of the 1 chord is there. This is a perfect authentic cadence. We would recognize that. Oops, let's do that. Let's get this back up here like this. We will recognize that and illustrate it with 2 phrase brackets, one ending with a half cadence and the other end ending in a perfect authentic cadence. Now, let's go back to our form structures, all the names that we were learning, like period structure and sentence and double period and all those kind of things. Okay. So here's your first definition. What is a period in music? Okay. A period is when you have a beginning section of phrases, usually just one phrase, but it could be more, a beginning section of phrases and an ending or complementary, right, section of phrases where the first group, the beginning group, right, ends in a cadence that is less final than the second group, right? So here I have a first phrase and a second phrase. Sometimes we call this the question. Hey, what's going on? And then the answer. Not much. How about you? That doesn't even ask how about you. Answers. We have special names for these in the book. You've seen them, but now we'll write them here. If your beginning section is like a question, we have a fancy name for that, and that's called antecedent. It's just a fancy musical word for the beginning or question part of a form. Okay. And the answer part is called the consequent. You just have to memorize that. But if you think of these small phrase forms, a period has an antecedent or question section and a consequent or answering the question section. Okay, so is this a period? A period is when you have an antecedent and a consequent, a question phrase and an answer phrase, where the first section's ending, half cadence in this case, is less final than the answer or consequent section's cadence. Perfect authentic cadence is most final, and this is less. And you can see the cadences lock them together and make them feel like they go together to ask a question and then answer that, or have an antecedent and a consequence. This is a period. Okay, this music that we listen to is a period. Now we can go further than that. We can say, like, well, how do they compare in material inside of them, and how do they compare in length? And the book talks about that. Okay, so if they are, we want to talk about length, right? Right, and we want to talk about like content, right? Content. So these phrases are the same length. You can tell as you sing it that they're balanced and the same. We could also look at the music and we could count the measures, I guess. But trust me, they're the same length. You see them through, you don't feel an imbalance. So if they're the same length, the antecedent phrase and the consequent phrase, this and this are the same length each, then we would call it symmetrical. Okay. And that's what it is. Okay. Oops. But if they were a different length, then we'd call them asymmetrical, or not the same length. I'm going to get to the end of this and realize that I've spelled all my asymmetricals wrong. But I think that's correct. Okay. And it's not. Okay. And then we have to look at the content and say, does the beginning of the music here, is it the same or similar as the beginning of the music there? I mean, you can look at the whole thing and say it's very similar all the way through, but really we're looking at the beginning of the music right here and here. Are they similar? Are they recognizably related? They don't have to be perfectly the same. A lot of time the music will be the beginning here the same, and then the end could be slightly different, right? And if they're the same or recognizably similar, then we have to call them parallel, meaning that the content runs parallel to each other. It is da 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 da, right? You can recognize them. And if they're not the same, then we call it contrasting. All right, it's not that. So what do we have here? This piece of music that we've been listening to and looking at is a parallel symmetrical period and can be diagrammed. I'll do it fresh down here in the following way. We would make a bracket for the first phrase. We would make a bracket to represent the second phrase, right? We could come in here and write this ends on measure 4 and that measure ends on measure 8. And we could write an A here and an A prime, meaning that this is the first material. We just call it A like in algebra, right? And then on the second phrase, we get something similar, but not perfectly the same. So we'll call it A prime. It's a variation on that because the endings are different, right? So we label those phrases. This tells us that the phrase lengths are the same, so it's symmetrical, and that the content of these is similar, especially at the beginning, so it's parallel, right? Then we mark in our cadences, half cadence, and a perfect authentic cadence right there. And we call this a parallel, I'm going to abbreviate, parallel symmetrical period. Now, if the phrase lengths were different, then we call it asymmetrical. If the materials were contrasting, not repeating the same material again, then we call it, we call this asymmetrical. We call it parallel, contrasting if they were different. If the cadences did not work out, that this was less conclusive, the half cadence, and more conclusive, then it wouldn't be a period at all. It might be repeated phrases or a group of phrases or something like that. Okay, and that's that.